Okay, so today we're going to start with chapter 1 of the James Rachel's book that you're supposed to be reading for this class. So we're going to read the first few chapters of this just to give us an introduction to the idea of ethics and moral philosophy. And chapter 1 is called What is Morality? So this chapter, like the whole of the Rachel's book, uses a lot of examples. He likes to use real life examples to give us an idea of what morality is and to give you things to think about. This slide presentation, by the way, you don't have to look at through this video, which is probably not the best way to look at it. I'm also uploading it as well as all the other PowerPoints to Moodle. So you may want to follow along on your device instead or look at it later. But anyway, so what is moral philosophy? He says it's a study of what morality is and what it requires of us. So the first part of this is probably the hardest, although both are difficult. So what is morality? He says there's no agreed upon definition of morality, which is fair because that's really what this whole class is about. What is morality? So we're going to get into that throughout the entire class, but this just gives us a starting point to sort of begin here. And we'll get into more of this later. But before he gets into that, as I said, he likes to start with examples. So what this chapter ends with, where it's going to, is this minimum conception of morality. Meaning that what is the core that every theory of morality should accept as a starting point? What are we trying to get at here? What is the point of moral philosophy? And so he gets to that through this series of examples, which if you were to look at after you've taken the course and go back at them, you will see some of the core principles and ideas that come into a lot of different moral theories being already talked about here with these first examples in this first chapter. Okay, so I go through these examples really pretty quickly. He gives a lot more detail in the book, so when you read the book, you'll see more detail of this, but I'm just going to go over them fairly quickly. The first one is baby Teresa. So this is a case in 1992 where this child was born with most of her brain missing, and he talks about exactly what part and what this means and everything like that. But the point of it is that a child like this cannot live for more than a few days and doesn't have any consciousness because of certain parts of the brain that are not present. This being has no consciousness and will not live for more than a couple days. Many of them don't live at all. They'll just be stillborn. Okay, so her parents said, look, we know this kid's not going to live. We want to have the birth and then have the child euthanized and donate her organs to other children. And Florida law said, no, you can't do that because somebody has to be actually dead before their organs can be donated. And so this did not happen, but people still argued about whether it should have been allowed. And perhaps surprisingly, given what Rachel says about it, most of the ethicists that were asked about this said, no, you can't do this. Now, again, they didn't do it, but the ethicists kind of were against this idea. Why was that? Well, the benefits argument that he talks about first is actually an argument for doing it. So the benefits argument says, if you can benefit someone else while doing no harm, then you should do that thing. And Rachel's argues that, and other people did perhaps as well, that it wouldn't harm Teresa to euthanize her because she was going to die anyway. She had no consciousness. There was no possibility that she would ever live more than a couple of days anyway, and other children could benefit from organs. So, on this argument, you can do good without hurting somebody, you ought to do it. Now, of course, you can argue whether it would hurt or harm Teresa to euthanize her, to kill her, and one argument says, look, being alive is better than being dead. So it would harm her to kill her because being alive is better than being dead. But then Rachel says, look, being alive only seems to be a benefit if you have thoughts, feelings, interactions with other people, maybe something like a normal life, or at least some kind of life at all. And since Teresa was not conscious, there was no possibility that she would ever be conscious, then maybe being alive was not a benefit to her, especially considering, again, that she was not going to live very long. And as we'll see later, Immanuel Kant argued that one of his definitions of whether something is good or not is whether you're using somebody as a means to an end. So you cannot ever just only use someone as a means. Now, as we'll see when we talk about Kant more, you can use someone as a means if that's not the only thing you're doing. So in other words, like if you are taking this class, you're using perhaps me as a professor as a means to learn something or to get your degree. But you're not using that person merely as a means, as Kant puts it, if you're respecting their autonomy, if they're getting something out of it, if they're consenting to it, and all these other factors. So there's a lot that goes into this idea of using her as a means. And as Rachel says, it's usually understood as a prohibition against violating a person's autonomy. So autonomy means, the ability to make their own decisions. So if you're enslaving somebody, for example, you're using them as a means only to an end that you want, because you're not giving them the choice to whether they are going to participate in this arrangement. They're enslaved, they don't have any choice. But this is a strange case, or a different case, because Teresa presumably has no autonomy, because Teresa is not conscious, so Teresa has no beliefs, no desires, no goals. So you can't violate someone's autonomy if they don't have autonomy. And again, this is an argument that you might use that people might have used in the past at least, for exploiting animals for various things, is to say, well, they don't have any autonomy anyway, so you can't violate it. And in fact, Kant would make that argument. I would not, and a lot of people wouldn't, but Kant did. So, but in this case, perhaps we can agree that since Teresa is not conscious, there's no possibility for her to have autonomy. So you might say the chair has no autonomy because it's not conscious. So it's, Teresa really isn't in any better a position than that. So maybe you can't use her as a means. It's not possible to use her as a means, I mean to say, because she doesn't have any autonomy anyhow. So Rachel says maybe this doesn't apply in her situation anyway. So what do you do about people who can't make decisions? Well, if you think about normal babies, let's say normal, babies with full brains, they can't make decisions either. But we presumably still can't use them as means or merely as means, and we must act in their interest. But again, this doesn't seem to really apply to Teresa because she doesn't really have a best interest, or to the extent that there is a best interest for her is just for her not to suffer. But if she's not conscious, she's not going to suffer anyway. So it's really not like dealing with another kind of baby where you can say, well, with other babies, you want to not put them into pain, for example, or you don't want to jeopardize their future. There's all these other considerations. Even though they can't make decisions, that doesn't mean that we can't make good decisions for them. But with baby Teresa, it's a bit different because she doesn't have a best interest in a sense. Since she has no chance at life, Rachel says, it seems that her best interest is consistent with taking her organs. We can't, she's going to die in a couple of days anyway. It doesn't really matter, perhaps. We can't ask what she would want since she's not conscious. And again, there's nothing for her to want. You could ask what another kind of baby would want by saying, well, when that child grows up, what would they wish we had done? you know. You can think of doing bad things to a baby that might affect them later, and at the time they can't make the decision, but you can reasonably say that, well, later on looking back, they'd say they wish you hadn't done that, right? But there's no later looking back for Teresa. Teresa's doesn't have a future. So perhaps he says this doesn't apply here either. It certainly seems like it's consistent that you could take her organs and not harm her. But then some ethicists wanted to say, look, well, it's just wrong to kill one person to save another person. And that brings up the question, is it wrong to kill always? Is it always wrong to kill? And there are people who believe this, but there aren't very many. Most people think that there are exceptions to this rule, such as self-defense, for example, perhaps assisted euthanasia, things like that. So there are definitely exceptions that most people accept. Is taking Teresa's organs an exception that we would accept? And he says maybe so, because again, she's going to die soon anyway. She's not conscious, so she doesn't have pain. She doesn't have beliefs and desires. And she has no chance at life. There's no, if you did not end her life, it was going to end in a couple of days anyway. So perhaps this is an exception. Then there's another way that he talks about this, which is, well, perhaps the wrongness of killing doesn't apply to her because perhaps she isn't really alive in a meaningful sense. So this is the definition of death that he talks about here. It seems like death is an easy thing to define. Either the thing is dead or it's alive, right? But the definition of death has actually changed over time. He says that it used to be we would talk about if somebody's heart stopped, they were dead, right? But now, at least in some circumstances, brain death is accepted as death because presumably once the consciousness is gone, once the brain is no longer active, even if the heart is still beating, you consider that person dead. And part of the reason he says that this was changed, and again, I think this is a lot more complicated maybe than Rachel's makes it out to be. I mean, you could probably go into a whole class on this, but is that they wanted to be able to do heart transplants, and so, but a lot of organs like the heart will deteriorate quickly once the person is dead, and so by redefining death as brain death, they were able to more easily harvest organs from people who perhaps were not dead in one sense, but maybe not conscious, so counted as dead for that reason. And I think there were other reasons as well, again, if we were looking into the history, but anyway, he says that maybe brain death could be redefined to include people like Teresa, so because they have no consciousness. And now he points out that Teresa does not count as being brain dead. He doesn't explain why, but I think it's because the parts of her brain that are there are not, perhaps, they are functioning. But you could presumably redefine brain death perhaps to include people like Teresa, and then at that point the wrongness of killing argument wouldn't apply because you could count her as already being not alive, given the state of her brain. Okay, so that brings up a number of issues. The Teresa case brings up a number of issues, and you can see how the arguments can kind of go back and forth. So he goes on then to talk about Jody and Mary, which were conjoined twins. And again, there's a longer story here that you can read in the book, but the basic idea is that if they weren't separated, they would die within 6 months. They could perform a surgery to separate them, but Mary, the way they were conjoined meant that Mary was not going to survive if they were separated. She didn't have enough. I forget if she didn't have enough organs or somehow her body was not capable of sustaining life on its own. And this happens with conjoined twins sometimes where one of them is, their body is supporting them. So separating them would kill Mary in a sense. or that's what the parents argued. And so the parents, who were Catholics, did not want to do this, but it ended up in court, and the court forced the parents to have the surgery performed because Jody would die, right, if the surgery was not performed. So they argued that the surgery wouldn't kill Mary, but would save Jody, and Mary's death would be an unfortunate result, but it would have happened anyway, again, because they both would have died within 6 months. And so we'll get into more of the judge's argument later, but that's the basic case. And so people argued for this separation, the surgery, because based on this argument, that we should save as many as we can. So I didn't really write the argument out, I probably should have, but the basic argument is we should save as many as we can, many people as we can, consistent with not hurting other people. The case of Jody and Mary is a case of where you can save one, or you can save none, so presumably you should save the one you can, right? So the choice is between saving one twin and letting both die. It seemed clear to the court that one should be saved, and they did a poll, and 78% of people agreed with that choice of action. But the parents argued from the sanctity of human life. They said it's wrong to kill Mary to save Jody, right? Just because, you shouldn't kill. And this is something that, there's a long debate about killing versus letting die and that sort of thing, but he doesn't get into that too much here. The judge argued, though, from the idea that the surgery wouldn't kill Mary, but instead her body's weakness would kill her. And again, this is the idea between killing and letting die, and sometimes called the doctrine of double effect. The idea is that, we don't mean to kill Mary. We're not killing Mary. It's just that we are performing the surgery that would save Jody, and the unfortunate side effect is that Mary's going to die. But again, Mary would have died anyway, and in fact, they both would have died. So Rachel's argues that the judge missed the point because the surgery, no matter whether the surgery was the direct cause or not, it hastened Mary's death. Again, I kind of wish Rachel had gotten into the whole doctrine of double effect here, but he doesn't, and that's a whole longer thing. But the idea is that, okay, maybe if you don't mean to do something, even if you know it's going to happen, you're not really doing that side effect directly, maybe you're less morally culpable for that. And in this case, it seems pretty clear that the intent isn't to kill Mary. It's not the same as if you took and stabbed somebody in the street, right? You're intending to save Jody, and the side effect is that Mary dies a little sooner. So it seems like there is perhaps a distinction between shooting somebody in the street and this kind of case, right? The killing versus letting die. And so Rachel proposes that maybe, normally we say killing of innocent people is wrong, right? But maybe there's an exception here, and maybe it's based on this. If the innocent person will die anyway soon, the innocent person has no wish to go on living, they might not have any wishes at all. I don't think he brings up whether Mary is conscious or not. I'm not sure how much brain activity that twin had, but in Teresa's case, clearly they have no wishes at all, right? Because they're not conscious. You can't have wishes if you're not conscious. And that others might be saved by the killing of the innocent. And then I think the last point is something that Rachel's doesn't clearly bring up, but I think it's important to say that all three of those conditions have to be met, I think, for this to be a reasonable exception. So you can't just have, or you might argue that 2 of the 3 or something like that, but clearly just one of them is not enough, especially not the first one. If you can say somebody will die soon anyway, I'm not sure that's enough to give you a reason to kill them, right? And again, I do think as well that he's ignoring this doctrine of double effect, which is that we're not really intending to kill Mary, and I do think that's important too. He doesn't bring that up, but it's an important point. So you can kind of see again with that case some of the issues that come up and how we might argue about them. These examples are just to get us thinking about some of this stuff, and it's really just bringing up things without necessarily resolving anything as yet. So here's his last one, is Tracy, 12-year-old with cerebral palsy. Her father killed her by carbon monoxide poisoning, and he argued that he did this because she was suffering and she had no hope for getting better ever. Okay, so she had undergone multiple painful surgeries. Her condition continued to deteriorate. Again, there wasn't any, like with Teresa and Jody and Mary, there wasn't any hope for her ever having any kind of life that wasn't just pain and suffering. So the outcome here was her father was sentenced by a judge to 1 year in prison, but the Supreme Court of Canada overruled the judge and required the father to serve the mandatory 10-year minimum because for second-degree murder, that was the minimum sentence. So he was found guilty, but people didn't necessarily think of him as a murderer, I think. So why did the court argue that he should serve the minimum? Well, he uses the word handicap because it's an older book, but some of the disabled groups made various arguments as to why they were happy that this decision was made, that he was forced to have the 10-year minimum. And one was that it was discrimination against disabled people. And this group argued that she was killed because she was disabled and that was wrong. That it's wrong to discriminate against a disabled person. Obviously, killing a disabled person is discrimination, according to him, and so he said that he should have served the full sentence. But the father argued that he did not kill her because she was disabled. He said he killed her because she was suffering, her life was torture, and there was no reason to think it would ever get any better. He just was tired of watching her suffer. He thought that it would be better for her to not go on living. So the argument wasn't that, for him, the reason wasn't that she was disabled, it was because of her suffering. It wasn't because he thought her life wasn't worth anything or was worth less, but rather because she was not living a life that she would want. He said something about, you could not say this was a happy child. Like, there was just no possibility for happiness for her. And some of the other disabled groups advocates also argued for the slippery slope argument. That something like this, that letting the father off or not giving him the full sentence would open the door for the idea that others can decide whether someone should live or die. And this is a common argument for this kind of thing. One thing about slippery slope arguments is that sometimes they are called a fallacy. And the reason for that is that you cannot predict the future, so you don't really know if something is going to lead to something else or not. So we don't know if letting this father off with a 1-year sentence would lead to people arguing that disabled people should be killed or discriminated against or counted for less. And it honestly wouldn't, right? But on the other hand, you can see maybe how that kind of argument is not completely a fallacy, because not all the time, and that it could be legitimate, because there are cases where you could imagine that someone's if someone is starting to judge people's life worth, and they're judging it based on whether they're disabled or not, that could lead to perhaps bad judgments like this, where you might say, well, this person, deserves less or shouldn't be here. And it's the same kind of argument people make against abortions for certain birth defects like Down syndrome. And people will argue that you shouldn't have abortions if you know that the child is going to have Down syndrome for the same kinds of reasons. But on the other hand, like I said, slippery slope has been used in illegitimate ways too. So when I was growing up, some of the arguments against gay marriage and against the rights of gay people had to do with things like that, it's going to be a slippery slope to bestiality, which obviously is not, or a slippery slope to pedophilia, which it obviously is not, because those things have nothing to do with each other, and it's just wrong to say that, if you let two consenting adults marry who happen to be the same gender, that's going to open the door to allowing people to marry 12-year-olds. It's just not going to happen, right? It's a completely different thing. I also saw this a lot, this argument, when I was younger, and I think this one still hangs around somewhat with drug legalization, the idea that, if you smoke pot, you're more likely to do hard drugs, and so it's a slippery slope, so we shouldn't let you smoke pot. And that one is just completely illegitimate and it's not even consistently applied, because if you were really going to do that, you would also ban caffeine, alcohol, and cigarettes, which they have not done. And it's not even clear that those things lead to anybody doing crack or anything anyway. So you have to be careful with slippery slope arguments. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider them, I think, because you can see how that might be. It might be an argument worth considering. Now, when I read the end of this chapter, I thought, he's going too far. But, read it and see what you think. So he ends this chapter by saying that these cases show us that two things. One, moral judgments must be backed by good reasons. And two, that morality requires an impartial consideration of each individual's interests. I think these are correct up to a point. So what he's arguing for is what I think of as the sort of old white man approach to ethics that has been going on since perhaps arguably Aristotle and Plato, way back. Is the idea that logic and reasoning is the gold standard, and that anything that doesn't sort of impartially conform to that is not a legitimate way of reasoning or arguing. And so he argues that feelings can get in the way of discovering the truth. We might feel that we know something's wrong, but if we can't provide reasons, we're not justified. And feelings can be irrational and based on bias, selfishness, or cultural conditioning. Also, people's feelings might vary on an issue. In other words, somebody might feel something's wrong, someone might not. And our feelings must be guided by reason. I think this is just absolutely the wrong approach, personally. And again, not all philosophers are going to agree with me, but they're not all going to agree with Rachel's either. And the problem here, I think, isn't the idea that we should try to provide reasons for our judgments. I think we absolutely should try to provide reasons for our judgments. But whether we can somehow impartially reason in a way that completely disregards our feelings and leaves aside bias, selfishness, or cultural conditioning, I think is a false dichotomy. Because I don't think that feelings for one, I don't think we can ignore feelings. I think we can convince ourselves we're ignoring feelings, but I don't think it's actually possible. I think that feelings can have bias, selfishness, and cultural conditioning built into them, but I also think reasoning can, and this is an important thing to remember, that when people claim that they are being impartial and that they're only relying on reasoning, I think they are lying, or lying to themselves, because I don't think that's possible. So I think we have to be really careful with this kind of thing. And I don't want to fall into relativism. We'll see that in the next chapter, and I think that's very important because I think a lot of students come into ethics classes and philosophy classes in general thinking that relativism is the way to go. And we'll see in the next chapter why that is bad, and I don't think relativism is the way to go. But I do think there's a middle way. I don't think there's reasoning on this side and there's relativism on the other side. There's nothing in between. So the idea that we can reason rationally without regard for our feelings is a complete fantasy. I don't think that's possible at all. I think reason is also driven by emotions, and some psychology has shown that we cannot reason effectively without using emotions, which seems very strange, right? But it turns out that the part of our brain that controls emotion is also very active in our reasoning process and is actually quite important to our reasoning process. And people who have brain damage such that their emotions are messed with or perhaps even muted or destroyed seem to completely lose the ability to reason in a rational way at all. So I think that this dichotomy between emotion and reason is just false. Also, it's important to remember that reason and arguments can be used to justify any number of terrible moral arguments. And we'll see this throughout the chapter, throughout the whole class. So I don't think that, again, you've got feelings on one side and that's bad, and reasoning on the other side and that's good, because people can reason for whatever conclusion they want. So we need our really good reasons, and I don't think that that's separate from emotion. And feminists and ethics of care proponents, who will see some of this later, have pushed back against this idea of impartial reasoning as a standard in philosophy more recently, and somewhat effectively and somewhat not effectively, depending, but I think this points to the idea that ethics and morality it's not like math, okay? It's not like logic even. It's much more complicated than that. And the idea that we can come up with one standard, one set of rules, or one way of figuring out what's right that's going to work for every situation, for everybody all the time, is highly unlikely and probably impossible. So, let's see if I have another slide here. Yeah, so again, I don't take this to be me saying relativism is good, because I don't think so. And the first point here, again, we haven't talked about relativism quite yet, but the idea that the statement murder is wrong is not like I like chocolate ice cream. It's not just a preference, I don't think. Now, there are philosophers who think this, but I don't think that ethical judgments are like preferences, and it's just as okay for you to say that you like a different kind of ice cream as for you to say it's okay to kill innocent children, right? I think that we can adopt a kind of caution about impartiality and a kind of caution about the use of reason without giving up on the idea of objective morality. In other words, objective morality means there is a right way to do stuff. There is a right way to act. There is a fact of the matter about whether killing baby Teresa is right or not. But I don't think we're going to get there. I don't think we're going to find what that objective morality is by some kind of reasoning that's completely divorced from our humanity and our emotion and our feelings. I don't think that's possible. So yes, we should attempt to give reasons. We should be impartial to the extent it's possible and helpful, but I don't think that we should expect to find perfect impartial moral rules that apply to every situation. And I don't think we need to do that in order to say there's an objective morality. Now, some philosophers are going to say that that's inconsistent. I mean, inconsistent by saying that, and maybe Rachel's would say that too. But this is something that we're going to think about all throughout the class, is whether that's possible and how that's possible. How is it possible for us to come up with an objective morality without falling into the trap of saying, well, yes, we can come up with a set of rules that's going to apply to every situation all the time, and it's going to be based on this sort of pure reason that we're talking about here. And so this is the punchline of the chapter for Rachel's. He says, morality is the effort to guide one's conduct by reason, to do what there are the best reasons for doing, while giving equal weight to the interests of each person affected by the decision. And this seems pretty reasonable. Again, I think it's putting a little too much emphasis on the idea that reason is the answer to everything, but it's not terrible. So this is for you to think about. What do you think about this definition? About this minimum conception of morality? Would this idea be a standard that you could use to kind of evaluate different moral schemes or moral theories? So do you agree with this minimum conception of morality that Rachel has come up with, or not? And that's the question for the end of chapter 1, which is again like just kind of giving you the groundwork for this whole class. So that's chapter 1, and I'll see you for chapter 2.